Now, one of the things that has frustrated me about this presidential race so far is I feel like the media has done everything they can to pit, one candidates against candidates, and the debates have kind of devolved into, well, he said this about you. What do you say about that? And it's driving me crazy. So I want to try to stick to the issues as best we can here. But I did think it was interesting watching Governor Walker as he exited the race. He suggested that perhaps other candidates should consider getting out of the race as well, those that are polling on the lower end, kind of start narrowing these things down. And it kind of got me thinking, what do you feel like that you are bringing to the race that you don't see in any other candidates that is compelling you to run for president this time?
Well, nobody else has ever faced the Clinton political machine repeatedly, defeated it, and lived to tell about it. And so if Hillary Clinton is likely to be the nominee, then nobody is better prepared to face Hillary and all that she's going to bring and all the artillery and apparatus than me. Secondly, I have a long record of having effectively governed in the most hostile of atmospheres because Arkansas had the most lopsided political climate of any state of the union, even more so than Massachusetts or Vermont or New Jersey or Maine or Wisconsin or any other state, 90% Democrat. But I also believe it has to do with the totality of life experience and having the judgment to be president. I just don't think this is a time when we can have someone learn on the job. This isn't an entry-level job. This isn't a job for someone who has never had the executive experience of running a government, because I just don't believe that it's worked out real well for us over the past 7 years to put someone in who had not served in that role. And I'm convinced that our country is in way too much trouble to say to someone, we're going to let you try this out and see. We have no record of your having executive experience. We don't know whether you can function in this particular position, because people can be great and brilliant in one thing and might not fit into another. And I know this, I don't think you'd let somebody fly you in an airplane who had never been in the cockpit. You'd probably not let somebody do surgery on you who had never been in an operating room.
Sure.
Why would you let someone take what would arguably be the most difficult job in the world, and we've never tested you? It's kind of like the biblical parable of the talents. If you're faithful with smaller things, we'll make you lord over bigger things. But if you've never been faithful with the little things, why would we trust you with bigger things? Truth is, if we're rational, we wouldn't.
Let's talk a little bit about your executive experiences. I was looking this morning over at the Cato Institute's website. They're a libertarian-leaning think tank, so maybe not ideologically, where you or I may be on some things just as conservatives. But they pointed out that during your 2 terms as governor, that spending increased at about 3 times the rate of inflation. They said that government workers increased by 20%, and the state's debt service increased by nearly $1 billion. And to finance that, the average Arkansan's tax burden was increased by about 47%. At a time when we've got $19 trillion in debt, can you make the argument that your record shows that you'll do something about that?
Well, first of all, the Cato study is incredibly flawed, and we have torn it apart repeatedly, and we've got information that is available on my website to do that. It's absolutely false. And let me give you a couple examples. When they talk about the $1 billion debt, that was to finance the road program that we paid for, paid off ahead of schedule, rebuilt more roads than we even promised, and it was voted on by the people of our state by an 80% margin. I think that's a pretty darn good record. When you say you're going to rebuild your roads, you do it under budget, ahead of schedule, and you build more roads than you said you were even going to do. You keep that promise, but we went into a bond program that was roughly $1 billion bond program, but we paid it off. The idea of the number of employees, once again, we had fewer employees in the executive branch over which we had control. There were increases in higher education because we took a lot of people who had been tenured. We let them retire. We brought in non-tenured part-time professors in community colleges and expanded that so that more people could go to college. So they looked at that as an increase in number of employees. The other thing, because we got tougher on crime, we saw huge decreases in the crime, but that meant we hired more prison guards. So if that's what they're accusing me of making the state safer, cutting the murder rate, bringing 50% per capita income increase to the average family in Arkansas. They don't ever tell you that. They don't tell you about the 94 tax cuts in a state that had a 90% Democratic legislature. It's a pretty strong record. People ought to take a real look at it. But the Cato Group, and there are some others, Club for Growth, you have to understand often they are funded by people who have an agenda, and it's not necessarily to tell the truth, it's to support another candidate.
Now, another issue that had, I guess, perhaps given me a pause a little bit with regard to your candidacy was Common Core. Now, I know recently, as you've run for president this time, you've obviously come out and said that you are not in favor of Common Core. But I do recall, a couple of years ago, you came and spoke at the Business Council of Alabama dinner, and I was there, and I looked back at the article I wrote over at Yellowhammer News after you spoke, and I did note that you had kind of given a full-throated defense of Common Core. What happened or what changed that compelled you to kind of walk that back?
Well, it wasn't that I changed, but Common Core did. Common Core originally was a state-controlled initiative that kept the federal government from taking control of education, and the whole idea was to create standards in math and language arts. That was it. Nothing about curriculum, data collection, nothing about topics other than math and language arts. But then the federal government got involved. They started tying funding to Common Core. They expanded it into other topics. They started building in curriculum requirements. And the next thing you know, Common Core becomes a Frankenmonster. It is utterly a disaster. It has been very hurtful to successful education. My own sister, who's been a teacher for 34 years, finally retired last year because she was just frustrated with how Common Core was being thrust upon them. So we all ought to be for high standards. I don't think anybody wants to dumb down our schools. But we don't want the federal government running it. We don't want them involved in it. As I read the 10th Amendment, there is no federal role for education, certainly not in funding and certainly not in mandating what students ought to have in the classroom. So what it started out to be, which was a local control issue, became something polar opposite by being an educational initiative that the federal government would be very involved in.
Let's talk a little bit about what a Mike Huckabee administration might look like. There's one question that every presidential candidate that I have spoken with, is kind of the one question that I ask every single one of them. We've got a guy down here in Alabama that we're all a big fan of. You may have heard of him. His name's Jeff Sessions. And
I like him a lot.
I would be curious to hear, would you be open to the possibility of perhaps a Jeff Sessions sliding into the role of Attorney General or some other cabinet post?
Well, it's funny you should mention that because I've publicly said that Jeff Sessions would be on the short list for AG. And he and I agree on a lot of things, immigration, Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm one of the few Republicans that join him in believing that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a disaster for working people across this country. And I appreciate the fact that he's strong for fundamental adherence to the Constitution. I just think that this is the single greatest issue the next president faces. When he takes the oath of office, does he truly believe, will he in fact enforce and uphold the Constitution, all of it, including will he resist the notion to surrender the entire executive branch over to the judiciary? Because we've got to stop the judicial tyranny that has threatened our basic form of government and our way of life.
Well, that brings up an issue that you have unquestioned credibility on, and that is the issue of religious liberty. I think a lot of us watched in horror as the 5 unelected judges, fundamentally changed what the meaning of marriage is in this country, and then even those who dissented in that pointed out quickly the religious liberty implications of that decision. What could you do as President of the United States to defend religious liberty in this country?
Well, I'd make sure I had an Attorney General and a Justice Department who was dispatched anywhere in the country where people's religious liberty were being trampled, whether it was a Kentucky county clerk, whether it was a florist in Washington, whether it was a photographer in New Mexico. the Justice Department would be there to defend the First Amendment guarantee of religious liberty, not to join in and actually pummel the religious liberty rights of people. That would be fundamental. And the second thing I would do is to make clear that the court can't make law. You just don't have the power at the Supreme Court to make a law.
Well, what recourse do we have? That, you know what I mean? Like right now, it's basically they are the final word on everything. Is that what the founders intended? I mean, what can you do
not only is it not what they intended, it's not what's written in the Constitution. This is a relatively new idea that the courts rule and we just throw up our hands and say it's the law of the land. And we've listened to that and accepted it because, frankly, of political cowardice. People in the other two branches of government who didn't want to take the political risk of taking a side on an issue were just to pretend that the Supreme Court could settle it and that's it. But the Supreme Court can only rule. They can't implement it. Jackson understood this. Jefferson understood this. Madison, Hamilton, Lincoln, all of them were very clear. People need to go back and not only read, of course, certainly the Constitution itself and who can make law, who can actually create legislation. The Supreme Court cannot. Jefferson said that leads to judicial tyranny and that you make the Constitution a thing of wax. But what should be happening is if the court rules, let's say on same-sex marriage, the president says we appreciate the decision, and now we'll turn it to the people's elected representatives and let them determine do they agree with that constitutional interpretation, and if they do, then write the statutory details that will tell us how to implement this. Because right now it is exactly what the four dissenting justices predicted. They said that it would create an unbelievable upheaval in our entire social structure because nobody knows how to make this applicable. The courts rule on something, and you don't just go out and immediately implement it because there's no one who has described how this is to be implemented. I'll give an example. When I was governor, the state Supreme Court ruled on school finance, and they ruled that our system of financing education was unconstitutional. I read their ruling. I agreed with them. They were right. But we didn't start sending out different checks the next day because, quite frankly, I didn't have the legal authority to order that until the legislature and I met and came up with a funding formula that we could agree to. Only then, when those with the power of the purse, the Congress, and those with the power of the sword, the executive branch, were in agreement, could you put into operation a court decision, because there has to be separation of powers, checks and balances, accountability, and agreement. Otherwise, you have utter chaos, which is what we've created in our form of government today.
So it sounds like you're advocating for, this ruling comes down from the Supreme Court on the state level, say here in Alabama, okay, we hear you, Supreme Court, let's put this up to a vote of the people. I think we know what happens in a state like Alabama. If the people vote on it, that goes down. At that point, are you saying that you would be in favor of, at the state level, the state looking back at the Supreme Court and saying, look, we put this to a vote of the people said no, and therefore we are not going to abide by this Supreme Court ruling?
That's exactly what I would do.
Gotcha.
I would absolutely do that because what we have now is a court that's out of control without the authority or the power to make that happen.
Well, Governor, we sure appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. Next time that you're here in the state of Alabama, hopefully we can get together. I'd love to spend a little bit more time with you, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right, you too. All right, Cliff Sims, Yellowhammer Radio. I'll be back in a minute.
This is Yellowhammer Radio.